Here is another beautifully illustrated game by Ryan Lockett. You will immediately recognize it from other games such as Near and Far. We also recognize a lot of the characters he created in his other games and which appear in Rome as well. Yet, this game from Red Raven Games is quite different from the others. There's no resource management, no movement and no storytelling. Instead, you get a lovely light game that's very easy to explain and learn and relatively quick to play. Rome follows the recent trend of games with polynomial shapes. You have a band of adventurers who each represent one of these shapes, and you take turns to turn one of them over and place the relevant shape on a shared game board. Unlike other games, you aren't allowed to rotate the shapes, and of course, you can't place your shape overlapping with others. The shapes themselves are also a bit unusual. In fact, some shapes have gaps, which you can choose to fill by paying coins, and you gain coins by covering coin symbols on the map. It sounds a bit confusing, but the game is very visual and you will quickly pick it up. The central game board actually consists of a grid of 2x3 cards, which themselves are divided into 2x3 squares. So the overall shared board consists of 6x6 squares. Your aim is to fill one of these cards, and as long as you have the most of your tokens on it, you then take the card and replace it with a new one from the stack. The cards give you victory points and at the same time add a new adventurer or a new shape to your team. As you can see, the game is very light. There are only so many choices you have on your turn. It is also a very visual game, as you have to see which of your available shapes fits the remaining cards best. You sometimes have to think a turn ahead, looking at what the other players might be planning, but that is about as far as strategy is involved in this game. Even though everyone plays on the same game board, there's actually not a huge amount of player interaction. Sure, chances are you will block someone else's shape before it's their turn, but that's about it. So it's definitely a competitive game, but at the same time I don't think there is any nastiness. For me, it's the sort of game you take with you to play with people who aren't heavy gamers. I taught it to my brother and sister-in-law, and they enjoyed it very much. It's also great when you want something lighter, so my wife and I will play it after a busy day at work, for example. The art style is wonderful as well. As you can see in my unboxing video, there's a link in the description of this podcast, so it's definitely worth taking a closer look at. The game also comes with a couple of variants that will change the gameplay up a little and make it a bit more competitive. However, overall it is a very light game that will give you half an hour of enjoyment and train your brain a little as you try and imagine how your shapes best fill the space. Thank you for listening to this Tabletop Games blog review. There's also a written version of it on my blog, links in the description of this podcast. There you'll also find links to my Ko-fi and Patreon pages if you want to support me financially. Other than that, please also like this podcast and subscribe to it. Leave some stars if you're an Apple Podcast. Everything would be really welcome. And review it if you can as well. Other than that, tell your friends about it. And generally, I hope you join me again for another episode of Tabletop Games Blog Review. Thanks for listening and bye! This podcast was made possible by my Patreon supporters, David Miller of Subquad Publishing, James Naylor of Naylor Games, Paul Grogan of Gaming Rules, Robin Kay of Ruined Sky Games, Sarah Reed of Undine Studios, Tim Vernick, and Richard Simpson of We're Not Wizards.